Nintendo is often characterized as quirky, as kooky, as weird, as fun, as the kings of left field, as some have coined it. I have done this intro now 3 separate times in an interval of like an hour because I've been trying to get this rant just right and just concise enough without going on a gazillion tangents. Nintendo just revealed the Nintendo Switch OLED model. It does not improve the hardware at all. All of the same frame rate issues and performance issues that you get with the base model Switch in games like Bowser's Fury and Breath of the Wild and other such games, they're all still going to persist. But at least in a handheld mode, your screen will look prettier. It'll still output to 720p at max, but it'll be prettier. And the speakers will be so much nicer, assuming you don't just use headphones like everybody else. And the kickstand is nice and wide if you use tabletop mode. Oh, and the new dock has a LAN adapter, if you don't have an Ethernet cable that has a USB adapter like I do. Oh, and the internal storage has been bumped up to 64 gigabytes, if you're averse to getting SD cards like I do. This thing is a very, very, very minimal improvement on the base Switch, and yet it is being priced at $350, a whole $50 more than the base Switch. You know the base Switch is 5 years old now? Is it really outlandish to suggest that it might be overdue for a price drop? Do you think that maybe the base Nintendo Switch should be $200 by now, and that maybe this new OLED model that has marginal improvements should replace it as the $300 model? I mean, considering the Nintendo Switch itself has sold like, what, 80 million something units? I think it's safe to say that most of the sales for this OLED model are going to be people who are double dipping. Who's going to want to double dip for a marginally better handheld mode experience? Some people, sure, and if you're gonna, more power to you, fine. But not more power to your Switch, because it literally doesn't have any more power than the base model Switch. And I'll be frank folks, even if this was a 4K console, I still wouldn't buy it. I am a frugal Fraggle Rock looking mother. But that doesn't mean this doesn't irk me, because it does. It is emblematic of Nintendo's issue with iterating. This is around the part of the rant where I go off on a lot of tangents, so I'm gonna try my very best not to go too wild with it, but nonetheless, if you have been a follower of my channel for a while, you will know that it frustrates me to no end how Nintendo treats the F-Zero franchise. They have not made a new console game in 18 years and have never re-released that last console game ever. The only way to play it in a way that Nintendo approves of is with the original disc, which, might I add, can only be played with a GameCube or a launch model Wii. I'm not going to go into all of the details as to why Nintendo is so averse to doing a new F-Zero. I've gone over it many times before. I'll probably have a card in the top corner there. But in essence, they say that they can't come up with a brand new game-changing idea for the series. And thus they are content to say that it isn't dead, just sleeping. And they won't wake it up until they bother thinking of something completely different. And if history is anything to go by, their definition of different is a remake of Star Fox 64 with an objectively worse control scheme. Oops! That doesn't bode well for the future. But then again, Nintendo were great big hypocrites because New Super Mario Bros., Kirby, Pokemon, 3D Zelda up until Breath of the Wild have all gotten away with being iterations on an idea that's been done multiple times before without a substantial game-changing new mechanic. This is where I stop talking about F-Zero now because I could go on forever. But let's apply this now to the new Nintendo Switch OLED model. Is this a substantial game-changing idea? A better screen in handheld mode? Marginally better screen in handheld mode? No, it is not. All of the improvements made here should not justify a higher price tag. And do you think it's any coincidence that this new Switch model looks suspiciously like a PlayStation 5? This primarily white color scheme with the black trim and buttons, etc. Yeah, this is supposed to be a PS5 looking Switch. It is, you can't tell me it's not. And Nintendo probably figures that with the higher price from the base model and the new color scheme and the fact that it is labeled as the blank model, they figure that some people shopping at Best Buy or Walmart or Target or something are going to look at it and say, hey, here's a next-gen system. You know, my little baby boy Bobby Brown has always wanted one of these new next-gen systems, and here's the cheapest one we can find. Nintendo have been such scum lately. With how poorly they handle the online, with how poorly they handle the Joy-Cons, with how poorly they handle redistributing old titles, like with Super Mario 3D All-Stars being limited time with hardly any improvements, and Skyward Sword being a standalone $60 game with all of these super expensive accessories to go along with it. It's so frustrating. Because even though in the Wii U era Nintendo didn't used to be much better, You know, it still took them 2 years to get Nintendo 64 games on the freaking Wii U Virtual Console. Even though the Wii U wasn't much better, it was better, and that hurts to say. Because the Wii U era of Nintendo was an era of arrogance, where they'd make a system that was less powerful than what their competitors were doing in 2005, where they still didn't understand how to do online right, and where the iterations on their franchises were very, very lackluster. But at least in the Wii U era, we got more Virtual Console systems. The online wasn't great, but at least it was free. And first-party games that sold well, after a while, were added to the Nintendo Select line and got permanent price drops to $20. The more and more we go in the Switch era, with hardly any Virtual Console offerings, re-releases and ports being priced so expensively, and now an iteration on the console that's more expensive with barely any improvements at the hardware side of it, it more and more makes me want to just hack the darn thing and put homebrew on it. You know, I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure I've heard from some outlets that the Nintendo Switch's chip is capable of doing AI upscaling or upfiltering or whatever you call it to make games look like they're in 4K. You ever see those videos of Rick Astley doing Never Gonna Give You Up in beautiful HD? Yeah, the Switch can do that, I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure. The fact that that exists, and the fact that, you know, homebrew is a thing and it's legal, it makes me want to just hack my Switch. I don't, because I'm afraid that Nintendo will release an update that'll brick it, so I'll just stick with the Wii U for now. But regardless, Nintendo said when the Switch first launched that they wanted its lifetime to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a decade. And just last year, they said that the Switch was somewhere in its halfway point. That is an awful long time to wait for Nintendo to start to attempt to get its act together. Because if the past is any indication, Nintendo waited until the Wii U was almost dead to give it some incentives. If the Nintendo Switch has to wait till like 2024 or 5 to get those features, it's gonna be too late. Nintendo is going to be looking to their next system, and we're going to start at square one again. And if we're not, and this time around all of their Virtual Console offerings, etc. will carry over into the next system, then that means they're just stringing along their loyal clientele, figuring they can get away with it because the majority of players this time around are totally new or returning for the first time in decades to Nintendo's ecosystem. Therefore, their embarrassingly lackluster retro library is perfectly suitable because the majority of their players never had one before. Or that the way they price their old games is perfectly suitable because the majority of players had never played them before. Despite the fact that multiple companies like Sega, Square Enix, Sony, and many others price their retro games accordingly. $50, $40, or even $30. And that's not even single games, that's whole collections of classic series. Because they know it doesn't take a substantial amount of effort to get those games working on the new systems. But yeah, this has been something of a tangent, but I'm keeping it in anyway. Nintendo have been miserly with the distribution of their hardware and their software this generation. Brand new original games hardly come out at the same rate as ports of previous generation games. The hardware is a whole generation behind the competition, and while Nintendo could definitely afford to bring it up to snuff with at least last generation, they don't, probably because it's cheaper. They don't see a need to, despite the fact that it would be nice, despite the fact that there is a sizable audience who wants that sort of thing, despite the fact that the games that they themselves make in a house are suffering for being on the lower end of the processing power spectrum. Despite all that, Nintendo isn't going to do anything about it because they are choosing the path of least resistance. Make the most money, spend the least amount of money. I guess it's just business, but customer satisfaction has got to count for something. But that, I think, is part of an overall bigger problem. Nintendo doesn't like their long-term fans. They must not, because all we do is criticize them for not being as good as they once were, or trying out these new sneaky tactics like the limited time releases and doing $60 ports of old games. Nintendo must absolutely love the casuals who don't know anything about this and just buy games off Best Buy for their nephews and grandchildren. They must love them so much more than players like me, who have been playing for years, if not decades, who have followed the progress and evolution of their series and their consoles and want them to get progressively better instead of going backwards or being worse or less fun or, you know, just Oh, this feels like a tangent, but it all relates back to this new Switch model. It is an insult, especially to the long-term players. But that is just one sock's opinion. What is yours? Please leave it in the comments below. I will read it. I might even reply to it. Who knows? And thank you for watching this video. Not just watching this video, but watching all the way to the end. That is awesome. Not many people can say they do that. Leaving a like on this video would help me out very, very much. Subscribing to my channel, if you haven't already, would also be much appreciated. I've got some videos in the work that I'm sure you'll love. The ones in the work are scripted and have neat production and gags and stuff like that. Not like this rant here. This was just sort of off the cuff. Hope you enjoyed it regardless. There will be more of this in the future, undoubtedly. But anywho, if you'd like to support my creative endeavors more than YouTube probably ever will, please consider pledging to my Patreon page for as little as $1 for behind-the-scenes updates and a credit at the end of my videos. Thanks again for listening. Screw you, Nintendo, and I will see you the next time I see you. I'm gonna have breakfast.